by the military-industrial complex.
And now, the Taliban will pay a price.
Do we have the confidence to do in the Middle East what our fathers and grandfathers accomplished in Europe and Asia?
The situation in Afghanistan is deteriorating.
What I do oppose is a dumb war.
So, I guess to kick off, my name is Max Kabachenko, and I emigrated to the States in January of 1992. I was born in Kiev, Ukraine. I came over here with my mom and my dad. Initially, both of my parents were married before, so my biological dad and his side of the family are still in Ukraine, including my half-sister's side of the family. But we came here, we came to Minnesota in 1992. I grew up in Kiev until I was about 8 years old, coming over here, and then grew up in Minnesota. I would say that coming to the United States was a big culture shock for me as a kid, for my mom and dad, our extended family, our relatives. It was quite an eye opener. There's a lot of growing up during communist Soviet Union times. There was a lot of propaganda that was given out to, or kind of fed to the people, you know, starting with kid level all the way up to grown-ups. And I remember reading kids' books, talking just kind of a quick experience about how the perceptions were of America coming over. There was a kid's book where a kid finds a genie in a bottle and he gets several wishes. And one of the wishes that he says, hey, I want to fly on the magic carpet to the United States. So, of course, he picks New York City as where he wants to go. And I read this as a kid in kindergarten. And so he flies over and he gets off the magic carpet and he's walking around, and it's a kid's book. So most, like half the page is just illustration. So my first depiction of New York was everyone's wearing, top suits with boiler hats with dollar bills coming out their cuffs and pretty much any opening or any pocket. Super wealthy, super obnoxious. And one of the first things that the Americans in New York asked the kid, they're like, hey, how much do you want for your friend, this genie bottle? And he's like, well, you can't buy this. He's a friend. And they're like, well, how much can we buy you for? And he's like, you can't buy a person. In Soviet Russia, we have inalienable rights. Like, you can't just buy a person. That's just wrong. And so that was my first experience before I came over as to what the United States is. So big, like I said, big culture shock, a lot of adjustments. My mom, I remember my great-grandmother, who at the time she was still alive, she lived through World War II and just Nazi encirclement and occupation of Kiev. And she broke down crying because she's never seen fresh fruit or produce products at a grocery store in the middle of January. So we went into a local grocery store, and it was a huge eye opener and kind of a shell shock to the entire family. So growing up, I've always wanted to join the military, and at the time, we came to the United States with green cards, basically, and then both of my parents had to apply for citizenship. And at the time, I was just turning 18. I actually got my citizenship through the United States Army. There's not a whole, if people don't, well, you guys are probably aware, but a lot of people don't realize you can't really do a whole lot of jobs in the United States military if you're not a citizen, because a lot of them require clearances. Specifically for my job, I enlisted as this is the old school designation, but as a 97 Echo or 35 Mike for the newer kids out there, which was a human intelligence collector, primarily because I speak, read, and write fluent Russian. So that really helped kind of accelerate and fast track my process of joining the Army. So I enlisted straight out of high school, right after basically 9/11 happened, and I joined via the delayed entry program and went into boot camp. I think it was winter. I'm sorry, it was January. It was January of 2004, and did AIT in Fort Huachuca, and went on my first deployment out to Iraq in 2004. So,
putting you to good use with that Russian language deal out in Iraq.
Funny story, actually. Very funny story. Like, I was just a greenhorn, just super wet behind the ears. I didn't do a whole lot of interrogations, a lot of it just kind of sitting in, but they, for those that don't know, that Saddam Hussein's army and a lot of his officers went to the Soviet military academies in the 80s just to get cross-trained on a lot of the equipment, the tactics. Um, so they captured a couple of Republican guards and Fedayins, and we didn't have, I can't remember the specific reason, but we didn't have an Arabic interpreter with us, and the guy ended up speaking Russian. So I interrogated him in Russian, which was, to me, like you said, I never thought that out of all places I would end up questioning someone in Russian, but I did. So yeah, language-wise, usage-wise, I guess the best experience that I had was going over to Grafenwehr, Germany. Basically, where this kind of feeds into a bigger story, but it was February of 2006 where I was stationed in Würzburg, Germany, with the 101st Military Intelligence Battalion, and the Russians, I would say, during the time where relations were much better than they are now, sent a contingent of NCOs out to Grafenwehr, which at that point in time had the PLDC course. And at the time, I was a specialist, and primarily I was going over there just to kind of be a translator. And the idea being is you kind of go through PLDC with these guys together. They learned from us, we learned from them. We culturally cross-train. We kind of trade stories back and forth, tactics, the whole 9 yards. And I would say about half of them spoke pretty broken English, but the other half did not. And to me, it was pretty cool just to think, here's these two, in my mind, kind of military superpowers. We're actually cross training. We're in good relations. We're having a good time. Um, it was really eye opening just because of there's so many similarities, but obviously differences. But it's just the similarities being a soldier's life. You're away from home. You're away from loved ones. You might deploy. You might not. You talk about missing friends. We talked about the wars in Afghanistan that was going on, as well as Iraq, kind of, and then contrast, the wars in Chechnya and their own problems with insurgency and terrorism, both at home and abroad. Um, and there was one very big thing that always stood out to me, um, specifically towards the end, and we were basically going through the graduation ceremonies and rehearsing, and one of the Russian sergeants, his name is Dima. Um, he was an infantryman, and he came up to me, and we're just having a cigarette, and he basically told me, it's such a shame that, I always thought of Americans as the bad guys, and you probably thought of us as we're the bad guys. But ultimately, at the end, it's, we're here to do a job, and we have so much in common. And what he said next really sunk in my mind. He said it would be a real shame if either one of our countries went to war with each other and you or I would have to look at each other through the scope of a rifle and have to pull the trigger after everything that we've been through and gone through and accomplished here. And that was in 2006. Um, that would be 16 years ago. And I still remember, I still remember that day having that conversation with him. And now with everything that's unfolding in Ukraine, it's almost surreal. Um, so
Yeah, that's a wild story, man. What kind of training were you doing out there? As far as I know, you were out there to be like an interpreter, but what can you describe that program you were part of? I remember talking to some like aviation friends at one point, Air Force guys. They were part of like a Clear Skies Treaty. I think it was called Clear Skies Treaty with Russia, where they were basically like cross training aviators doing the same thing. So that's interesting.
yeah, more than anything, it was they literally took a company-size element of Russian NCOs and just threw them into American PLDC and made them just go through it with us. Like you laugh, but that is literally what happened. There was I think one of the one of the funniest contentions that we saw was there was they have a tank. They have an M1 Abrams tank simulator at Grafenwehr because it's one of the tank ranges out in Germany. And I think the accompanying He was either, I think he was a colonel or higher, at minimum of a colonel. I regret not remembering his rank, but we were sitting in the tank simulator, and he kind of started this low key argument with the senior officer that I was translating for, basically stating that the T-72 and the T-80 and the T-90s are superior tanks, and I'm trying to like politely tell him no, while also trying to, not to laugh and translate for the officer. So there were a couple of pissing matches, I won't lie, but for the most part, it was wholehearted. Like there wasn't any animosity or any, there were some preconceived notions, but it was professional, and it was friendly, and it was actually kind of rewarding to see that happen more than anything.
I think anytime two militaries get together, like two countries, they'll, especially people like in the military, they'll generally bash each other's equipment. I remember like when my father-in-law was alive, even before I was in the army, he would be like, "Ah, Americans," and he hated the Red Army, hated the communists, and he got kicked out of the Red Army for not joining the party and all this other stuff. But he's like, the Sukhoi is a better fighter jet. And it's like you have no vested interest in saying that, but it's just funny, like the back and forth there.
So when I think about that relationship, being there, working alongside the Russians as a translator between the armies, the best example for people I think might be something like in Band of Brothers, where you get towards the end of the series, and Shifty Powers, who was in the 101st, is talking about they were just, the Americans are doing their job and the Germans are doing their job. Hitler kills himself. The war in Europe is over, and then they turn around and they start working alongside each other, almost like there's an understanding at the at the troop level, not the command level, but at the troop level, that we're all just here to do a job, and we don't really want any sort of bloodshed or conflict. And I think it's very obvious that there's a disconnect between us at the level that we were at and those at the strategic command level.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, if you look at the war right now, I don't want to like skip ahead topic wise, but a lot of the guys that were sent in by the Russian Federation, um, they weren't aware. They didn't know, and I think that if I strongly believe that if they knew what they were doing, a lot of them would have resisted very strongly. Just because not only it's almost like kicking the door in your neighbor's house and just moving in forcibly, in a sense. If you've been living with that neighbor for generations, like your parents, your grandparents, their great grandparents, that would be like almost the equivalent of how it's seen, is the best way that I could kind of boil it down.
Yeah. I think that kind of falls in nicely with the sort of surprising slash unsurprising fact that a lot of the units didn't even know what they were doing, like right up until the last minute. I was reading somewhere, apparently a lot of the basically, if you weren't in an airborne unit or in like Russian SF unit, you had no idea where you were even going, and it's kind of a clusterfuck on the ground for a lot of them. A lot of them can't contact command or anything. So
And another thing I want for the listeners to understand is, so like here stateside, we don't have conscription. Everything's volunteer. Um, in Russia, you have conscription and volunteers. So normally, traditionally, those that actually volunteer are, the majority of the time, are treated much better than the individuals that are not. So a lot of the conscripts were the ones that were kind of thrown in as the first wave. And then like you said, the airborne forces, the SF, those are the more battle hardened, more loyal guys and gals that they're not going to easily question orders, I would say.
Yeah, you look at the footage or the pictures of the first two Russian soldiers who were captured, and there's no way they're older than 19.
Kids, they're
It's
kids.
very obvious that those are conscripts,
Yeah,
right? They're meat bags, bullet catchers.
and that is the most disheartening part is, it's, I mean, I was 19 when I deployed, but looking back now, it's like, damn, like kids. And the fact that I think there's a couple of big factors. A, they were either told or not told, but if they were told, they were said that Ukrainians would just welcome them with flowers and bread and salt. And obviously, that is the complete opposite of what's happening right now. And just like the lack of equipment, their supply lines, everything that's going on, the issues that they're having right now, they were basically told a swift and decisive victory, and now it's turning into a protracted siege in a sense, with Kiev being, they're the number one city right now of the target.
I saw a video that just shows how ill prepared I think a lot of these people were, and it was just like two kids and like a BTR, and like an armored truck, and they're out, like they're stuck on the side of the road in Ukraine, and this guy pulls up in his car. He goes, "Hey, what's going on?" I'm like, "Yeah, we
You
broke
guys need a
down."
tow?
It's like, "You guys just there?" He's like, "I'll tow you." It's like, "Really?" It's like, "I'll tow you back to Russia if you want to go back to Russia." It's like, he's like, "Where are we?" It's like, Kiev's that way. That's what I said. It's just like, how are you so I guess a lot of this doesn't make it down to those conscripts that they get sent in there. It's just like, and why would, and the American army would never just leave you stranded in
No,
a
no way.
armored car
I
on the
mean,
side of a road in an invasion. Like, well, I don't know, maybe.
They'll leave you stranded in Afghanistan.
Yeah, they might leave you in Afghanistan.
you also have to look at how we would treat people in the service here stateside versus how the military is viewed in Russia. It is not viewed as a professional institution in the sense of you do your time in service or you decide to make a career out of it. It's prestige, it's stature, it's access to different parts of the contracting world, whether it's government or civilian. But over there it's considered, I don't want to say a dead end, but it's not a career that a lot of people choose. Hey, I'm going to go join the military because I want to do this. So, between the training, the equipment, you can see that. I mean, um, I kind of think that sometimes people view, or at least I see Russia as kind of like a glass cannon or a paper tiger. Um, like their Su-57 fighter jets, like they've been trying to get them built and up and running, and their program keeps running behind. They've had so many drastic reductions in the military, primarily after the collapse of the Soviet Union, just not being able to maintain all that inventory and equipment. And personally, this is my belief. Why are we seeing, the attacks not going as well as they're supposed to? Is I personally think that a lot of the older equipment and military stuff is being thrown in. Um, I think case in point is I mean, we haven't seen any of the Russian Air Force. I and I think they could easily have air superiority over Ukraine, but for one reason or another, they're not risking it. We're just seeing a lot of older Mi-8s, transport helicopters, older fighter jets that are coming in, but not really seeing any of the bleeding edge. Or, if you're invading another state, you would try to, kind of bring forth some of your best equipment, but we're not really seeing that right now, especially in the air domain.
Do you think it's a desire to save money and like the risk of a Su-57 getting shot down versus a old MiG-29 from 1979 getting shot down is a bit of a different?
I think that plays part in it just because we've heavily armed the Ukrainian military with manpads, with Stinger missiles. I know Poland is basically supplying the upgraded version of the Igla and the Strela launchers, which were updated by Poland. Basically the manpad version, but the Russian made. But we've, in Syria, Russia has been using allegedly they've said they've flown combat sorties with the Su-57s, but they've been using the fighter jets over there, but primarily, like you said, older ones. And I don't know if you guys read the articles from a year and a half ago, but like they had a MiG that basically literally ran out of fuel and it crashed in the Mediterranean. I think this incident happened twice, so it's it's a lot of little things that can kind of add up. But I do think that the Stingers are a big deterrent, but not completely. Um, I know that right now that Ukraine is trying to do everything in its power to get some sort of anti-air defense systems, because literally they're just fielding S-200s and S-300s right now, and I believe the S-300s are the ones that are being placed around the major cities, Kiev included, as anti-air capabilities.
Well, I mean, so we're on the topic, right? So I guess let's let's start with the recent beginning. Do we start with 2014? Do we need to start with 91 in NATO?
Well, we can start where I'll start with 2014. Um, so collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine becomes independent in the early 90s, and up and I would say up until 2014, it the best explanation I give it, it was democratic in name only. I would say, um, post collapse of the Soviet Union, you can kind of see a lot of the former Soviet republics have had strongmen that remain in power just to kind of preserve the status quo. Reason being because they know they will get the backing from Russia and vice versa. Um, 2014 was a very important year because that was the year when the public wanted much closer relations with the West. So what happened was there was an agreement, and it was basically to have closer association with the European Union, with the idea and the hopes of ascending to the European Union, and then possibly NATO down the road. What ended up happening is the president and basically the government rejected the reform and said, no, we don't want that. We want to go ahead and have closer ties with Russia. And the people basically, that was the breaking point. They've had enough. And when I say enough, um, Ukraine, Ukraine and Russia rank extremely low in the poverty and corruption index. In fact, I think Ukraine actually ranks lower than Russia last time that I checked.
So I I did check on that today because we do want to touch on that later on when we point out that it's not like there's a clear good guy in this whole thing, but Russia is 125th according to the Corruption Perception Index, which the metric is private sector wealth, power, and influence gained through the public sector. Russia is 125th. The bigger the number, the worse it is. Ukraine is 122nd, right? So it's very close, very similar, right? And then 2014, that was Yanukovych, right, who had always been more of a not a Putin, closer to Putin than he was to the European Union.
Correct.
If my memory serves me right, the last big project I did in the army, I worked on the whole what the hell is going on in Ukraine during the annexation of Crimea. I worked with a warrant officer who was from Yalta, and I couldn't understand a word he said, and that was all fun stuff.
Correct. Which kicked off a large series of protests in Maidan Square, which is Revolutionary Square. It's what you're seeing behind me. And those protests basically started in November of 2013, and they went through all the way through February of 2014. I would best describe them as brutal repression by the government at the time. People were being the police and the special police basically used rubber bullets, but they also ended up using live ammunition. Scores of people were killed, journalists included. It was it was a really rough time. My grandmother, who is actually in Kiev right now, I talked to her earlier today. Kind of surreal having to talk to my grandmother sitting in a bomb shelter and dealing with air raid sirens. But she would she would go and deliver food and supplies and medicine to the volunteers in the hospitals that were injured. It was a very personal endeavor. A lot of Ukrainians were very much emotionally and personally invested in it, and I think it showed a lot of resolve and spirit, and it showed just people not wanting to deal with the status quo anymore. They did not want to continue to have Ukraine be democratic in name only. They wanted change. They wanted transparency, accountability, um, and that's why, you know, they had the uprising. And thankfully, things prevailed. There was an agreement signed in February. It was called the Agreement on the Settlement of Political Crisis in Ukraine, and basically it was the cessation of hostilities between the opposition parties and giving up of the weapons by the opposition, and hopefully going back to the old constitution of 2004 and having elections and parliamentary elections. Uh, Also, that's when Yanukovych fled to Russia. because he was facing mounting opposition to be held accountable for basically allowing the government bodies, the various government bodies, to go out and use basically violent force, lethal ammunition against the protesters, and just doing everything in their power to repress the uprising.
So, Max, you can certainly help flesh this out a little more. So after Yanukovych, you had, was it Poroshenko became the new the
Poroshenko,
next
yep,
president?
the chocolate king, billionaire, as they call him.
Yeah. So the way I look at his tenure as president is I look at it as an overcorrection, right? And please correct me if I'm wrong. We are wrong very often, especially with something like this that's outside of our wheelhouse. But I look at Poroshenko. He uh, was staunchly anti-Russian influence to the point that there was concerns about like Ukrainian nationalism seeping into the government and ostracizing and targeting the Russian-born speaking population, or the Russian-speaking populations in the Donbass region, and obviously in Crimea, where you'd already had the Russian annexation. Is it safe to say that that's what you had, that overcorrection, which only made matters worse?
Maybe, and I say this maybe because for the listeners, if you ever look at a map of Ukraine, the most western part of Ukraine is where the majority of the ethnic Ukrainians and Ukrainian speakers are located, and then you kind of have the middle where it's a pretty even mix of Russian Ukrainian speakers, and then the closer you get to the Russian border, the more you'll see individuals who don't speak Ukrainian. They might mix. Syrzhuk is it's a mixture of Russian and Ukrainian, but basically the further east you go, the more predominantly Russian speaking you are. I think that there is some truth to it, just because of the repression and the nationalistic pride, and that did not exist during the Soviet Union. So when I went to school, I went to first grade and kindergarten in Kiev, Ukraine. So Ukrainian was not taught at all whatsoever. It was strictly Russian. So my parents and my grandparents and my great grandmother, they spoke Ukrainian. So when individuals say, one of the things that Putin keeps bringing up is, Russian is kind of being shit on. You're not allowed to speak Russian or say anything in Russian. I think that's a huge farce. I went to Ukraine in 2017 for the first time at that time in 25 years, and I haven't had a chance to go back home since I left. And it was so nice just to be able to go and speak Russian. No one gave a shit about your nationality. No one cared. People speak Ukrainian, Russian, but if I were to ask, who are you? People would say in Russian, "Я украинец." They wouldn't say "Я русский," which means I'm Russian. They would say "Я украинец." And I think that it's very heartening to see that those two cultures, those two languages can coexist. But to kind of answer your question, I think there was also a lot of expectations for Ukraine to join the European Union, to join NATO. Russia obviously took the opportunity to kick things off in 2014 to kind of put the kibosh on that for a bit, at least. And I will say that with Azov Battalion and Right Sector, that definitely brought a lot of those concerns to bear, and that was used to really instill a lot of, I guess I would say, a lot of fear, or attempt to instill a lot of fear into the Russian-speaking population, especially further out east. But it's also ironic that the current president of Ukraine, Zelensky, he's Ukrainian, but he's Jewish, and so is his family. And to have the majority of the population elect a Jewish Ukrainian president, but to have President Putin say the country is being run by a bunch of Nazis it just doesn't make sense, I guess.
Yeah, I think that is something important to point out. and most of our listeners are in America, right? And so when Joe Biden won the election, people tried to say that he had a mandate. No, he didn't. He didn't have a mandate. Zelensky won with almost 74% of the vote. That's a mandate, right? That's a pretty telling sign that at minimum, the people of Ukraine don't have a problem with a Jewish guy running the country, right? And yeah, for Putin to come out and say something like that, I think is absolutely. I mean, it's clearly a lie, right? And Zelensky he's been president for a little over 2 years now, and like, he's kind of fallen into some of the historical issues, right? There's questions about some legislation he's proposed regarding suppression of the media and things like that. But I think on the surface level, he is trying to make the government a little more transparent. Like I think it's kind of hard to do though in a place like Ukraine that was one part of the Soviet Union for so long and still kind of trying to get their footing as an independent nation in a part of the world where they are the buffer between Europe and Russia. It's an undesirable position to be in, right? I don't envy the leader of Ukraine, whoever they are, having to balance who's on their east and who's on their west.
Yeah, I know that some of my relatives and I personally, initially when he was elected, I won't lie, I was like, "What the hell? Like, is this actually serious?" Um, but now watching how he has handled things, like I'm incredibly proud, um, and it's very heartening to see that he is genuinely trying, and he has motivated an entire country to stand and uprise. Um, just not just there, but even here stateside. Um, just seeing him broadcast, he's like he's unshaven, he hasn't slept in hours, but he doesn't give a shit. Like he wants the people to know that he's here, he's not going anywhere. Like that famous quote, like I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. So
My question is though, and what my wife, like before we started recording, she's Russian, and what she was talking about today is, and this is not to like throw down on these people who are fighting an aggressive expansion invasion. I mean, I get it, that's noble. But how much in the West is what we're seeing purely Ukrainian propaganda as opposed to I know Kiev is kind of like the big focus, but like other news reports, like if you start looking at reports, I mean, Russians are closing in on the other cities there, like kind of an encirclement campaign. So it's like Kiev for the time being is it seems they're holding out, but I don't know how well that's working for other cities, and I don't think we'd ever see that until one day maybe that occupation is complete, and then people are just gonna be like, "How did he do it?" Because we haven't seen really an objective reporting on the situation.
I agree, and honestly, in this day and age, a lot of it is information war. It is. I will say that we don't see Ukraine publishing an official tally of their losses. You know, I personally have not seen one. I follow a lot of different blogs, a lot of different subreddits, but they've been very mum about the casualties, and I definitely that they are mounting. They are obviously also very quick to point out, any victories, both big and small, updating the Russian casualty numbers as well. I think a lot of it has to do with morale more than anything. This is a very serious situation, and I think people get that. I think also part of the problem is you're not going to have a whole lot of Western media focused on the smaller towns. The big news reporting is going to come from Kharkiv, from Kiev, maybe from Mariupol, but a lot of the smaller towns that are being enveloped, you're not going to get that coverage, unfortunately. I also don't know how easy it is to access some of those locations just because of the Russian military and whether or not they will allow the press to go in. Um, Another one thing to also keep in mind for the listeners as well is Russia is waging also a very much heavy-handed propaganda war in terms of not showing footage from what you would maybe see on like Reuters or AP News or CNN. Specifically things like when they used an MLRS to basically shoot the center of Kharkiv with like a rocket barrage into the center of the town indiscriminately and just kill a bunch of civilians. So those types of things will not get shown in the Russian media, just to kind of keep the public opinion as much as possible going in favor of the Kremlin. So I definitely think that, like, that was a very long-winded question, but yes, I think Ukraine is trying to kind of keep a lid on things as well, propaganda-wise.
I know, looking at the coverage here stateside, right? The other day I turned the news on, and there's news reports that the Russians are in Pripyat, where Chernobyl is. I'm like, who gives a shit? It's an abandoned town, not relevant, right? So I think there certainly is a disconnect between what's important and what's not, and a good, I think a good parallel to that, given that this is usually an Afghanistan centric podcast, is that we didn't lose the war, or we didn't lose, we didn't defeat the insurgency. It's not because of our efforts in Kabul and Kandahar and Herat. It's because of our efforts in all the little towns and villages around Kabul and Kandahar and Herat. Um, and I think for the news is going to be centered on Kharkiv and Kiev and Mariupol, and maybe they shouldn't be now. And I completely agree with you. Right? Who knows how easy it is to move freely? I mean, it's a mystery. But for the most part, right now, what we're only seeing is what's going on in the big cities, and the four of us know, having been to Iraq and or Afghanistan, that the war is not won in the big cities. It's won in the rural areas around those big cities.
Correct. Yeah, I completely agree. I think that as long as people can see that the government is actively resisting and is Kiev stands, it gives that motivation to the other towns. But realistically speaking, it's a David versus Goliath kind of battle. Um, can they take Kiev? Yes. Can they grab the other towns? Yes. I think that there's a couple of ways that things can have an outcome. I think personally that Putin wants, his number one goal is to topple the government. He wants to install a very much pro-Russia government. I very much strongly believe that will never happen, just because the people have been so galvanized and they've given up so much in the Euromaidan, and now with this war, it's not going to happen. The next best plausible scenario would be to create a land bridge from Crimea all the way to the Russian border, which they do not have right now. And if you look at the current advances, or at least what we can speculate what the current gains to territorial gains are, that is what it looks like on the map of Ukraine. Crimea right now is basically locked. It's landlocked, and they don't have a direct land route to Russia. So I think that's one of the biggest objectives that they're going to try and accomplish, is basically creating a corridor from southern Ukraine and basically going northeast and having that connection. I don't think that they can hold a city of over 3 million people.
No, you're probably right. And I'm sure Putin knows that. If he doesn't know it, then maybe it's just further confirmation that he might just be losing it. Uh, so, like, in between the Euromaidan and now, there's the formation of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic out there on that eastern border. I hope I'm saying those right. Like, it that's really confusing, like, to me. And I worked on this damn topic for 6 months before I got out of the army. uh, so to try to understand it better, you've got, like you said, the further east you go, you have a higher concentration of native Russian speakers. So I imagine with that's going to be a higher concentration of Russian identity. Were those separatist movements born out of the Euromaidan? And essentially, after the annexation of Crimea, they decided, well, maybe we can get annexed too if we, fight back hard enough. I think there's a bit of a gray area for, I know myself and probably a lot of the listeners, as to the formation of those two separatist movements.
I think one of the biggest things is, when they did a survey, the predominantly eastern regions of Ukraine were very much against the Maidan. I think excuse me, I think there were easily between 60 to 70% of the population in those two areas that were very much against it. They did not want, or quote unquote, the regime change. Um, so another thing to understand is those areas have been long neglected infrastructure wise by the government, central government of Ukraine, meaning roads, schools, anything that would help develop what we would consider to help develop urban development or just population growth. I mean, those areas are very much run down. They're predominantly coal production and coal mining areas. So the majority of the population lives and works in the coal mines. They're not very, they're not usually not very well educated in terms of post-secondary education, let alone, what we would consider high school. So a lot of just small villages very close to the border. So appealing to that national identity and just kind of saying, well, you've been living in this status quo for X amount of years. Central government has ignored you. Now there's yet another regime change. Can you really count on them to come in and help you out? But on the flip side of things, there was no law that was passed, going into that region saying you can't speak Russian anymore. You can only speak Ukrainian. There was no real what we would consider the central government coming in and trying to impose Ukrainian nationalism on them. I think that it was a combination of socioeconomic factors, the regime change in Ukraine, and also the fact that they were not comfortable with the fact of that regime change because of Yanukovych wanted much closer ties to Russia versus the West. So obviously they didn't agree. But at the same time, I also think that for individuals, the running joke with some of my Ukrainian friends is, all of a sudden these coal miners became professional BTR drivers and tank drivers, and here's all this equipment that they all of a sudden know how to utilize. That didn't happen overnight either. A third party came in and helped him out. So yes, I do believe that there was discontent with the decision to put Ukraine further west aligned, but I also don't believe that they just decided to rebel one day and say, hey, our rights are being trampled and this is completely unfair. We want to keep speaking Russian and we're tired of this Ukrainian nationalism.
What's the Russian equivalent of the Culinary Institute of America? I guess the FSB. Do you think maybe they had some work in setting all that up?
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about poisoning dissidents, then maybe. No, it's definitely, I think it's kind of, if people don't think that Russia didn't have a hand in arming and equipping them, hats off to you. But like I said, you don't just get an influx of brand new equipment overnight and just become magically being able to operate it. And I think part of the goal that Putin really wanted to do is he wanted to put the kibosh on the European Union and the NATO ascension. And by creating a frozen conflict in eastern Ukraine, he accomplished that. Because it puts a huge obstacle and roadblock for Ukraine in order to join the European Union and NATO. And by basically doing that, he is at least putting a pause in it, which allows him, the time to do what he's doing right now.
We watch this conflict unfold, and to be honest, like, it just gives me the absolute creeps because, you remember in basic training, I'm sure you do, Max, I mean, they basically training you for this fold a gap scenario.
Yep.
Where the Russians come streaming across. It's 1989, and you got the Javelin missiles, and you got all this other, stuff that you're like, we'll never use that in Afghanistan. Well, here it is. It's being used now, and it's horrifying to watch the ways that we've invented to absolutely destroy one another. Things that you thought that the average person would see is like undestroyable is just blown up by a guy with a freaking handheld missile. And it's like, that is, at the end of the day, like a full scale conventional war, like a worldwide war, would look like that, but a billion times worse. And I think people are hopefully seeing that and realizing the absolute horror of all of it. But I don't know if that's the case, It's just it seems like you got hawks on both sides that want to perpetuate it, and it's like, I mean, I don't know. It's terrifying to watch it unfold. Like a bad Tom Clancy novel.
It truly is, and one of the things that I think could have helped prevent or at least deter it is the Budapest Memorandum and Agreement in the mid 90s. So Ukraine actually had a bunch of Soviet nuclear weapons on their territory. So when the Soviet Union fell apart, the United States was like, "Hey guys, do you mind kind of getting rid of those? That'd be really cool if you did." And they did. But one of the things that they signed a security agreement, basically guaranteeing the interior territorial integrity of Ukraine. I believe it was United States, France, and the United Kingdom, but I might be wrong on one of those two. But basically, you give up the nukes, we guarantee you the rights protection. And now, obviously, that is not happening. And nuclear weapons are also a deterrent. And I know that one of the things that Zelensky brought up, he said, we used to be the manufacturing facility for nuclear weapons in the Soviet Union. We can go ahead and do it again if we want to. If Ukraine, both the country and the government survive what's going on right now, I think that's going to be their next big move, is having that nuclear deterrent. Unfortunately, I think that the only things that Putin will understand are brute force and violence. Diplomacy, we have seen diplomacy get us this far, and to me, it's absolutely unreal that the year is 2022, and there is a large-scale conflict in Europe right now where population centers are being indiscriminately hit, and civilians are dying. It's to me, it's insane. Like, I think that a lot of us can speak that we hopefully, once we got out of the service, that we would not see anything like this within our lifetime happen, and it's surreal to have it happen.
That's a good segue, right? Because I was reading up on the Budapest Agreement, and I'm gonna hop on my libertarian soapbox for a second because, well, I can. It's our podcast. We can do what we want. Um, an armed society is a polite society. Like the concept of that, I know we do speak about nuclear weapons being a deterrent. I mean, they kind of have. They haven't been used since 1945. I like when you look back on that. I mean, obviously, hindsight being everything it is, pretty bad decision to give up your nukes, right? But I wonder how much that was, so recently removed from the Soviet Union and just not sure of, the way forward. And you got the U.S., you got the U.K., you got France, and oh yeah, we'll protect you. The problem is that's not like a defense treaty or anything like that. That's an agreement. It's not particularly binding, which then brings in the NATO question, right? And you know, Ukraine's not joining NATO anytime soon. And for the people that are wondering, because it's in plenty of news articles why they're not doing it, Ukraine meets all the requirements except for uh, the requirement of a at least relatively non-corrupt government, right? Something we talked about earlier, right? And Max, I appreciate you helping bring some context to that because it's easy enough for us three guys who were born and raised in the States, to say it, but you can at least quantify some of that. I mean, it's there, right? Ukraine as a government is corrupt. It does
Yes.
exist, and it's so corrupt as it stands right now. It's not joining NATO, and that's why I don't understand. Well, I say I don't understand from an out as an intelligence analyst. I understand Vladimir Putin's decision. I think, but like looking at it as somebody who's not who wasn't in the industry, if you will, that we were in, to sit here and bitch and moan and say, oh well, Ukraine's going to join they're going to join NATO and that's a threat against Russian sovereignty. Well, it's not because they're not joining NATO, and Vladimir Putin knows full well that they're not joining NATO. But it then brings the question of, do we need to reevaluate the role and the necessity and the mission of NATO?
I think that it it leads into how Putin sees NATO, how he sees the West. Um, Personally, I think it's kind of ironic for how much hatred the West gets from Russia, or at least the Russian government, maybe not the people. I mean, they love driving the cars made in the West. They love consuming our movies, our music, our culture, our clothing, our food. All those things are fine. But I think it's some of the freedoms that we enjoy in the West that he finds uncomfortable. So NATO's role initially was to act as a deterrent to the Soviet Union. Um, and I think that Putin sees NATO's expansion as a threat to his rule, but more importantly, his military power, because I want people to also think of it this way, that, Russia back during the Cold War, one of the things that we did as the United States is we put nuclear missiles in Turkey, and Russia was, well, the Soviet Union at the time was very much not cash money about that decision. They were very, very upset about it. It caused a lot of point of contention, and I think Putin's concern is having Ukraine join NATO. It's basically directly at your doorstep. Here's a NATO country. If we wanted to put weapons there, we could. Maybe in his mind, that's how he sees it. But like you said, Ukraine is caught between a rock and a hard place. It wants to join the European Union. It wants to join NATO, and part of the reason it wants to join NATO because it's, in a sense, it's kind of tired of being bullied by its bigger neighbor. I think one of the outcomes out of this is that Ukraine might just claim neutrality status, at least for the time being, um, in order to preserve its integrity and government as a country, but also to not cause any further point of contention with Russia. But I think their ultimate goal is that they do want to join NATO. They want to have those closer ties. Um, it's the reason I think a lot of the Baltic states and Ukraine included want to join is because they have seen how Putin rewards those who toe the line government-wise and those that he punishes if they don't. I mean, you could look at our northwest neighbor, Belarus with Lukashenko. He's been in power since '94. I mean, he's literally a dictator. So I think that is what is pushing a lot of countries. Not because they are afraid, in a sense. They're afraid that their government and their way of life is going to mirror what the Soviet Union used to be, and they are going to be democratic in name only, more than anything. And that is why Ukraine is striving so hard to join NATO, not because of, hey, we want to act as a deterrent, because we need the protection. If we don't toe the line, we're just going to become the next Belarusian Republic or the next Kazakhstan, the next dictator, almost, in a sense.
Do you think it's that there's just not many independent states left? I think that's it. And it feels like as we head toward a more like globalized culture, that these powerful nations are going to gobble up whatever they can. I mean, China's looking at Taiwan. That's probably going to happen. Uh, Russia would love to take all those independent states and put them under its protectorate, so it has more, something else to bring to the table. NATO, of course, it's still accepting members. I mean, you can still join. It's like I think that's it. I think it's a kind of a 2022 land grab in a way, and I think we're going to see it more. I think China's looking at how the West responds to Russia, and I think if they respond adequately or inadequately, then China's got Taiwan, and that'll be that taking over as well.
I think that Putin wants, in a sense, to rebuild the Soviet Union, or the ghost of the Soviet Union. I mean, we've seen how quickly he responded in restoring order, quote unquote, in Kazakhstan during the riots last year, and how violent they were. I think that as this is a guy who stayed in power for over 20 years, who's amended the Constitution to allow himself to run for president more than twice, who had his prime minister Medvedev basically be a sock puppet for a term. Um, I I really want listeners to understand that Russia is a democracy in my eyes, and name only at this point. You have a leader who has refused to let go of power. He has very much slowly but surely consolidated a lot of the media outlets and power. One of the things I really wanted to at least just touch on for just a couple of minutes is the large amount of journalists that were killed and are being killed in Russia right now, trying to provide independent investigative journalism. Um, if I could pick one journalist to talk about real quick, it would be Anna Paletskovskaya. I read her book when I was in high school. It's called I believe it's called Dispatches from Chechnya: A Small Corner of Hell. So the Chechen wars were very much not popular in Russia, the first and second ones, up until things turned around at the end of the second one. But basically, in the Caucasus regions, there was a insurgency that Russia was trying to fight and put the kibosh on, and Russia was using brutal military tactics. For example, shelling Grozny indiscriminately with rocket artillery, but more importantly, they would go into villages in Chechnya, and they would do what we would in Russian it's called zachistka, which means the literal translation is to clean up or to mop up. They knew that most of the military aged males and the Chechen fighters were hiding up in the mountains, so they would round up, you know, the villagers whoever were left, the men, and then they would torture them or they would execute them, and they would dig mass graves and dump their bodies. So she ended up uncovering some of these war crimes that were going on in Chechnya in the first and second Chechen War, and she ended up being assassinated and killed in the early 2000s. There's actually CCTV video footage of her being shot execution style in her elevator, and she was a reporter for Novaya Gazeta, which means new newspaper. And that is one of the few remaining independent newspapers that still operates. And I think they've had at least 7 journalists that have been killed since the early 2000s under mysterious circumstances or crimes that were never solved. The perpetrators were never found. And I just want people to understand how much Putin really controls the media, that he is willing to at least approve, state-based, state-sponsored, or state-sanctioned assassinations of journalists.
My wife seems to think he just kind of has lost his mind, but not that it wasn't always like this, but that early on in his presidency or in his rule, I suppose at this point, it's you had people to tell him, nah, I don't think so, or like people that were dissenting voices. But over time, over 20 years, you have all those dissenting voices executed or poisoned with polonium or kicked out or exiled. And now all you have is yes men and a bunch of rich people that sit around and tell you what you want to hear. So any idea that he gets in his head is just that's what's going to happen. So nobody's going to tell him no. And I think that's kind of what's happened when you stay in power that long.
One interesting thing that you did mention, the rich guys, the oligarchs. So for those that don't know, the oligarchs are basically the individuals who became very wealthy or super wealthy in a very short amount of time, either through lucrative contracts or by very shady dealings or associations with Russia or in Ukraine. There's oligarchs in a lot of the former Soviet republics. I think it was 2 or 3 days ago, once the sanctions got approved by the United States and the European Union, that he basically had a meeting with the senior oligarchs, come in and kind of explain to them, hey, this is what's going on, but also asking for their support, because Russia has a very large amount of reserves, and they've spent a lot of time paying off their sovereign debt, or at least reconsolidating their assets so they could hopefully ride out the storm. And one of the things is a lot of the funding, a lot of the money is also being held up by the oligarchs. It's kind of you scratch my back, I scratch yours. Putin's government provides very lucrative contracts with huge sums of monies to his personal close friends and associates, who in turn owned multiple businesses, whether it's construction, media, communications, and then they use that money to conduct business. Once these sanctions are hitting, it's they ultimately it's the average, run of the day Russian individual that's really going to start feeling them, but the oligarchs are really going to start feeling the pressure. I think that the sanctions are very much needed, but short term they will help shore up Putin's position, just because the average Russian citizen is going to be feeling that squeeze more than anything versus the rich individual. But as time goes on, they're going to start feeling that squeeze as well.
We talked briefly before we started, right? And bringing up Vladimir Putin and the oligarchs. I think something that people need to understand. Vladimir Putin portrays himself as a very pious individual, and I think he reports his net wealth to be, or net worth to be, something around my net worth, which there's no way. There's reports that he is potentially the richest man in the world,
Yep.
/ wealthiest man in the world. When you look at the backdoor deals and stuff, I know that his rumored longtime girlfriend, former Russian gymnast, is like, her company was awarded the contract for Netflix's operating rights within Russia. He's the one who awards those rights. Like, Vladimir Putin himself is an oligarch, but he's the most dangerous kind of oligarch, where his bank account is the Russian bank account. Um, like, I've spent the last week trying to wrap my head around why the hell is this happening at this point in time, and uh, I made the mistake of going to social media to hear other people's responses, and I'm very disheartened by our fellow Americans who sit here and talk about why it's happening, and it's because Joe Biden's president, or because Donald Trump is president, or is not president, or this wouldn't have happened with a different leader, or this would have happened with the right leader. And it's very frustrating to see this red team versus blue team nonsense. And I want the listeners to understand, because we have a lot more listeners now who have no military background like we do. This isn't red team, blue team, right? I think I think it's safe to say that Vladimir Putin had his sights set on doing this, regardless of who the American president was. And we need to take a step back and look at the facts at hand. And the facts at hand are a country that was a non-threatening neighbor has been invaded by a larger, stronger military, without probable cause, without any semblance of Russia trying to defend themselves. And that's something that people need to realize, right? It's not like there's no justification in my eyes for Russia to do this beyond whatever justification Vladimir Putin conjures up in his head, and then tells to the state media, or tells to the Duma when it's time to authorize the decisions.
He's really his ultimate big worry is NATO ascension. That is why this happened. I think he also, the other thing is the land bridge to Crimea. Those are his big things. Trying to stop Ukraine from joining NATO is his number one priority. Establishing a land bridge to Crimea is his second priority right now, and he's trying to basically do both of them right now. He's been trying to tell his population, his soldiers, anyone within his inner circle, and just in Russia in general, that we are liberating Ukraine from the Nazi junta, who are oppressing people's rights to speak Russian, and we are here to protect them. Case in point, Kharkiv is really close to the Russian border. It is a predominantly Russian-speaking city. And what did he do yesterday? He launched a MLRS rocket barrage into the center of the city, heavily populated area, and killed scores of innocent civilians. So in Russian, the term is Ruski Mir, meaning Russian world. Mir, ironically, also has several meanings in Russian, one of them being peace as well as world. So a lot of the YouTube videos or the Reddit videos that I've been watching is just Russians, just native Russian speakers, thanking Vladimir Putin for bringing his Ruski Mir to Ukraine by just basically indiscriminately destroying civilian infrastructure. I think that
It's a play on Pax Romana, isn't it, though?
yeah,
Being like Third Rome, and the whole idea of Moscow is Third Rome with the Orthodox collapse in Constantinople, and it's like the same kind of concept, Ruski Mir.
yeah, it's just wanting to bring back the Soviet Union, which ironically, I think there was a quote in the late 90s where he basically said that communism is just nothing but dead end alleys and streets. It's a dead ideology. It's stupid. It's pointless. But everything that he is doing, it points otherwise. So to him, Ukraine is out of all the former Soviet republics, Ukraine is prize number one to him. You'll have unfettered access to the Black Sea. Crimea has a land bridge. You install a puppet government. You basically create this giant, massive buffer state between NATO and Europe and Russia. So to him, this is something that is worth fighting over, even if it means, I mean, it is insane that he is willing to cause his currency to completely plummet, inflation to skyrocket, interest rates just to go completely out of hand. I know that SWIFT they've been cut off from SWIFT. The major banks have been targeted, and I want the listeners to understand this is all at the expense of the Russian population. He doesn't give a shit. This guy is billions wealthy. He does not care. It is the average Russian citizen that is going to suffer, and that is what sucks, because their economy, for those that don't know, Russia's economy is very much petroleum and natural gas reliant, export heavy, and because of that, they are really going to start feeling the squeeze of these sanctions. But at the end of the day, it is the average citizen that unfortunately suffers. And one of the consequences in the short term, like I said previously, is I think that there's going to be much more anti-Western sentiment in Russia because of it.
Probably a good place to stop then. We've hit our hour mark. We usually don't like to make them too long, but yeah, Max, thanks for coming on, giving us some insight into the this horrible conflict. And I don't know, it's one of those things I don't really have much to say about, because it's just horrible. There's no sense in it.
Yeah,
And
it's I've literally been on the phone with friends and relatives, just not getting any sleep. It's pretty brutal, guys. I won't lie. It's something that I hope no one else has to ever go through.
I mean, I'm sure it is. Like we're familiar, right, with the concept of warfare, and then to have it be like this, where it's so close to home for you and your family, there's no way to try to rationalize what's going on. But as is customary, Max, we're going to give you last say. Anything you want to put out there, and in whatever language you want to put out there, whoever you want to say it to, the floor is yours, man. Thank you for coming on.
Ditto. No, thank you for having me, guys. A lot of people will probably wonder, what can you do to help Ukraine? There's a couple of options. I know if you go on Instagram right now and you just type in Ukrainian Army and you pull up their official account, they actually have a crypto wallet. No joke. You can literally donate directly to the Ukrainian Army right now through their crypto wallet. They also have a list of other avenues that you can go ahead and utilize. Reach out to your state, local, and federal representatives. I myself was very lucky to come to the United States because my family is granted refugee status. That allowed us to bypass a lot of the bullshit and the red tape that it usually takes individuals to come here stateside. Please, please, please reach out to your congressman and ask them what they can do to grant Ukrainian refugees temporary refugee status here stateside. We're a country of immigrants. I'm an immigrant. I tend to think that immigrants enrich our society. They bring a lot of good. I came over here. I served in the United States Army. I did a couple of tours overseas. I tried to make this country a much better place before I got here. So I want you to know that Ukrainians are loving and caring and hardworking people. Anything that you can do to make this less of a humanitarian catastrophe would mean a lot to me personally. So please just reach out to your representatives, let them know what's going on, and more importantly, just be vested and be emotionally invested in what's going on around the world. This is a huge situation that could blow up into something much more serious. So sometimes it can be very disheartening for veterans to see that, America, the joke is, is America at war? It's like, no, the Army and the Navy and the Air Force and the Marine Corps are at war, but America's at the mall. Um, I really want our listeners to understand just the severity of this. This is something that we hoped in our generation we would never see again, but here it is. It's full-fledged scale warfare in Europe. So with that being said, I just want to say one more thing in Russian. Героям слава и слава Ukraini. So with that being said, guys, I really appreciate you having me on the show. Thank you again for having me over. It means a lot to be able to bring some of my experience and background and hopefully share it with your listeners and educate them as well. Okay. It's Putin huilo. Putin is a dickhead.